Hey, U.S. Sister students, it's Mr. Baker again. Hope you're doing great. This is Baker's Corner. This is our third and last session, the Depression and also the FDR New Deal. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into where we left off. So if you remember, just a quick review of last time, we talked about the 3Rs, relief, recovery, reform. We talked about how his New Deal addressed things like farming and banks, protecting the stock market, the workers, farmers, etc. Okay, and I left off, guys, with the idea of how labor unions are going to gain some strength. But I asked the question, what probably is the most well-known program with FDR's New Deal? And I would say that probably for a lot of people, it's going to be Social Security. So kind of maybe pause, guys, for a second if you want and ask yourself the question, have you ever heard of it? Do you know anything about it? Is there anything about it that maybe you want to ask your teacher or even Mr. Baker in class if it's not covered in this session, those of you that watch it? Okay. And for a lot of people, what comes to mind first are things like retirement. They think about kinds of taxes that you pay into the Social Security system, et cetera. Okay. And they also a lot of times think about things like Medicare, which, by the way, comes around about 30 years later. But nonetheless, there is a connection there as time moves on. So I want you to look at my screen. So those of you that are paying into the Social Security system, students, parents, et cetera, okay, you probably are aware that Social Security taxes you at a certain level, okay? And so a lot of students, they look at this, and you're welcome to pause, guys, if you need to, and they say, okay, well, what does all this information tell me? Okay, well, at the end of the day, what it tells us is what kind of benefits that you would be eligible for Social Security. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, guys, if you look here, you'll notice that there are essentially three major categories, okay, in which you can qualify for Social Security. You've got retirement, you've got disability, and you've also got people that are family survivors. Okay, so, like, for example, just a quick personal story here. When my dad unexpectedly passed away when I was 5 going on 6 in 1980, my mom still had a young son, myself, that was basically trying to raise me. And guys, Social Security does have a policy, as you can see here, that actually is set up to help people with those kinds of needs. Okay. Unemployment insurance is another thing that you hear about, but that's something that you can look at on your own time. Okay. But I would say that probably for most people, the part of Social Security that becomes probably the more well-known or thought about is going to be how it applies to retirement. Okay. So I'm not going to say a lot about this because I think you studied this in other classes too. But if I'm paying into my system, my 6.2%, and then my employer is doing the same, et cetera. Okay. If you're self-employed, you do that for yourself and the business side. So you're paying essentially 12.4%, I think it is, per year. But anyway, okay. But you'll notice, guys, that if Mr. Baker were to work until age 62, I would make, according to my last statement, $1,332 a month. If I wait until 67, then I would wait until about I would make about 1,927. And if I wait until age 70, as you can see, I would make a little bit less than $2,400. Okay. The thing that I like to ask my students to kind of challenge them with this, guys, is to kind of ask themselves the question, we don't know when we're going to basically be, passing away or whatever. Okay. But if you were in a position to be able to make a decision about when you draw in Social Security, what factors might play into that? Now, that might be anything from if you have a state that you're on a state pension plan and, taking out a pension through your state also impacts the level of Social Security that you can get, et cetera. Okay. Those are things that obviously play into that. For some people, it might be like, for example, if you have to early retire and let's say you benefit or you qualify for disability, but let's say you don't qualify for Medicare until age 65, maybe you have to, probably a good idea for you to have some kind of insurance. Maybe somebody starts drawing their Social Security earlier rather than later, just because they need to have some kind of support for those kinds of expenses. Okay. I have a family member of mine that retired early, like early 50s, and took out his Social Security earlier at age 62, so early on, to be able to meet the needs of that. Okay. And so why is it a big deal? Well, in 1935, Congress, under FDR support, is going to promote this. Now, believe it or not, this was not a part of FDR's first New Deal. So there's going to be a couple of different New Deals that come later. Okay. And so why isn't it? All right. Well, one of the reasons why was, we'll look at in a second, is that there were some criticisms that his New Deal did not go far enough to benefit the people. Okay. But if you take a look, guys, you'll notice that a lot of people, just a real quick story on this, guys, is people always hear the stories about Social Security. America's population is expanding quite a bit because of different reasons. Okay. And the answer is, or the question is, okay, is Social Security going to be there long term? And I think it's a fair question. Okay. And guys, a lot of students that don't know much about Social Security ask, okay, why is it that Social Security now is more kind of at risk than it once was? Well, if you take a look at this chart, you can exactly see the reasoning behind it. Okay. So in 1940, which is 5 years after Social Security was first put forth, we have, as you can see here, about 350,000, 390 people multiplied by 1,000 that are actually paying into the system. Okay, when you pay into your system, guys, of Social Security, to my knowledge, you're not really paying into your own privatized account like your bank account. You're paying into the system. And of course, the system is benefiting those that are currently getting benefits. Okay, now look at the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries are 222,000. So there's a big ratio between the number of beneficiaries and the workers. And that's a pretty good thing to have, because you're basically having a higher amount of money. But what is happening, guys, between 1940 and, as you can see, about 8 years ago with 2013, you're noticing a lot more recipients. In other words, people that are actually getting their benefits. And what are we noticing about the numbers that's paying in? The number is going up, but as you can see here, the ratio is smaller. Okay, so I want you to think, why would that maybe be a concern? And guys, I don't know if it's simple math entirely, but the idea is, if you have a system that is supposed to support a certain number of people, there's a smaller number of people paying into it now and a larger number of people getting it, that system is eventually going down in the amount of money that they're bringing in, right? So therefore, you hear all these different things, debates, et cetera, about how do you move forward with the system, right? Because I'll give you an example, guys. If you look at my previous screen here, you'll notice just a real quick thing in the bold here, but I think it's a bold for a reason. It says Congress has made changes to the law in the past and can do so at any time. So what does that mean? It means that they can pass legislation to increase the percentage of money that you get per month, which they usually do. Cost of living increases. The law governing benefit amounts may change, because by 2037, you all might be wondering, why does it say 2037 on Mr. Baker's? That's when I will be age 62. The payroll taxes collected will be enough to pay only about 76% of scheduled benefits. So if that holds true, you can basically multiply, guys, what you see above there, those numbers times 0.76, and that's pretty much what you're getting in benefits if that estimate or that projection holds true. Okay. And a lot of students are like, okay, well, Mr. Baker, how much, of your income is actually taxed? It's not the entire amount of income. So for example, guys, if you bring in, like I'm going to use Jeff Bezos as an example here. Let's say he made like 70 or 80 billion last year, whatever it was. It was a huge amount. Okay. You're not paying Social Security tax on every single amount of money you make. You can see here, guys, that up until a certain amount of money is where you'll be taxed up to that 6.2, or I think it is 12.4%. So as of a few years ago, okay, that number was, as you can see, 118,500. Okay. So I don't know of a ton of people that are making that amount of money per year, but they certainly are out there. But even if you're somebody that makes, several million a year, Patrick Mahomes, where you're making 40 or 50 mil, okay, they're only going to tax you up until that amount, according to the way it works now. Okay. And a lot of students are like, okay, well, where does the idea of Social Security play into our fiscal spending? Well, as of 2019, and this is cut off here, so I apologize, but about 24% of our fiscal spending, which is a fancy way of saying what our government spends on different things that they spend on, You can see they're spending 14% or 24%, excuse me. So almost a quarter of our federal spending is related to that particular amount. Okay. Social Security. Medicare is another 14%, as you can see. And then Medicaid, which is another healthcare program that's set up by federal government for more disadvantaged or whatever people. And then you'll notice, again, a few other things there. But I just mostly want to point that out to you. Okay. So to kind of end our conversation, guys, on the New Deal, we need to understand that not everybody agreed with it. Not everybody agrees that it was the best thing in the world. I once heard one history teacher of mine in the past say that FDR was kind of like Andrew Jackson in this respect. You either loved him or you hated him, right? There wasn't a lot of in between, right? Now, I didn't live back then, so I don't know the political culture, okay? But reading things, there's maybe a little bit of truth to that, okay? But the one thing, guys, that we want to be able to do with FDR is we want to be able to divide his administration, his critics into what are called liberal critics and also conservative critics, and understand what is meant by those terms and also certain reasoning behind why people made that argument. Okay. So liberal critics would be the critics that were like, okay, the New Deal does not go far enough. Okay. Does it affect our economic system? Yes. But there's a need for even a new system. Okay. So there's still too much maybe capitalism here. There needs to be more, government involvement, regulation. Okay. More government control over the factories, the farms, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And therefore, because of that, a government is, again, more experimental. It's doing more. It's more involved. And guys, here's one thing that is interesting to note and maybe think about what this means. More government redistribution of wealth. Okay. So that's going to be the argument that comes up, guys, whenever you hear like the wealth gap is widening and the paying of the fair share of taxes and things like that. That's going to be something where a lot of times it comes up. Modern politics, you hear about this a lot of times with certain candidates and things like that. Okay. And so they want the government to be more involved. All right. We'll look at a couple of examples. Now, there's always a polar opposite. And this is going to be the conservatives. New Deal goes too far. What does that mean? It did too much. It overtaxes the rich, right? The people that have, there's a small percentage of wealthy people, but unless they control a lot of the wealth, okay, it takes away their ability to actually do more with their money through philanthropy or whatever. Okay, is socialistic. What does that mean? The idea of socialistic here is, the government is moving in a direction of having more control over our economy. It's regulating things more. Okay. It's basically getting further in the direction of mixture when it comes to government's involvement. All right. And the argument is, guys, is that when government is more involved, they're regulating more. The conservative argument, as you can see here, puts unconstitutional limits on personal freedoms. Okay. So what essentially is that getting at? What it's getting at, guys, for the most part, is that people look at this as an issue of I should be able to have the freedom to make my own choices. And as a result of that, there's going to be a lot of issues with people that don't agree with this extent of government interaction in the economy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So a couple of examples of critics. You're welcome to stop your screen here if you want. Okay. But the one at top is going to be one of the more outspoken political critics. Okay. It's Father Charles Coughlin. So he's going to be a member of the Catholic Church. Okay. So at first he's going to be like, okay, maybe some of these smaller scale things of FDR are kind of a good thing in a sense, but then he becomes more and more and more critical. This is kind of taking too much advantage of the business class or whatever. Okay. I would say, guys, what probably gets Father Charles Coughlin into the most trouble is not necessarily going to be that, but he had a radio show, if you didn't know this. And so he makes a lot of anti-Semitic comments and things on the air, which is basically anti-Jewish comments. That doesn't sit well in general, let alone if you're a church official. Okay, so obviously he's not going to keep his popularity, and he eventually is, I think, taken off the air, etc. Okay, but he is one of the more well-known critics. Okay, now, leaning toward international socialism, that's going to be one of the accusations that Coughlin makes. Okay, so therefore, that's a term that even guys in this time period is a little bit more, let's just say, people are more resistant to it. And you see the rise, guys, by this point in time of course, communist Soviet Union. Okay, other places that have some more government involvement, etc. Okay, of course, this is kind of the dawn of World War II as well. Keep in mind. Okay, so there's a lot of criticism out there. Now, what about the liberal critics? These are both going to be probably the best examples, guys, of people that did not agree with Roosevelt. That he had a responsibility to go a step further with his policies, with his reforms. Huey Long is probably the most well-known, or one of them certainly, of the people that actually was in the Senate. He was a Louisiana native. He believed in what was called share the wealth. What does that sound like? Yeah. So wealth redistribution. So guys, if you go back to the idea of more government redistribution of the wealth, that's going to be one of the things that he advocates. Now, he makes a famous speech that became known, as you see in the quotes here, guys, as Share the Wealth speech. And he makes one of the famous quotes in that speech, make every man a king. And that's pretty much in a sense, he doesn't believe in royalty, I don't think, guys. But what he's talking about is, the government should give every family of four, like a $5,000, amount per year, something like that. Okay. And as you can imagine, right, he's making an argument that the New Deal needs to do more. There needs to be a less of a gap between the rich and the poor. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense if you think about it from the standpoint of the liberal criticisms. Kind of a neat little story with Huey Long. I had a parent of mine that told me this. He was from Louisiana. He loved to filibuster in the Senate. And there was some bill, maybe it was a economic bill, whatever it was, and he ran out of stuff to say. And so what is a big thing in Louisiana sometimes? Cajun recipes. And so he pulls out a Cajun cookbook. And evidently, guys, according to the story, is that he starts to use the cookbook recipes to actually continue his filibuster. All right. So anyway, filibusters don't have to be on topic. They just have to basically delay a vote. And that's kind of what he did. Okay. He eventually ends up being shot. All right. So his ideas were not liked by everybody. Okay. All right. Dr. Francis Townsend. This guy is, of course, a doctor. He's the person, as you can see, that is considered to be one of the leading voices between the Social Security system. Okay. So the old age pension, right? That if you're a certain age, the government should guarantee your, a guaranteed wage, or not a wage, but a retirement account or an amount up until around about $200 per year or per month, I think it was. Okay. And so, maybe we don't have Social Security if we don't have this outspoken person, right? Maybe we don't have some of the future programs with wealth, when it comes to certain things, if we don't have Huey Long. Okay. But as you can imagine, both of these sides are going to basically go in directions at criticizing FDR. Okay. And the question is, guys, I want you to think about, in the next slide, you can pause, take a screenshot, write it down if you want, is his legacy. Guys, he's the longest tenured president ever in American history. And unless we have an amendment to the 22nd, he will always be that for the rest of the nation's history. Okay. He was elected 4 times, 32, 36, 40, and 44. So his legacy is definitely there every time you hear about Social Security, bank reform, minimum wage. Okay. The idea of prohibition coming to an end to a large extent. And so the question is, guys, if you want to break his effects into economic, political, social, and cultural categories, we didn't say a lot about cultural, but those of you that love artwork and music and dance and singing and different things like that, okay, you would have really liked FDR. All right. If you go back to my video from the first session, guys, you probably noticed like some things related to like humor and, different things like that, the music. Okay, guys, I mean, if you think about it, the Three Stooges, right, kind of slapstick comedy, Wizard of Oz, those kinds of stories that come out of this time period. FDR really thought that was a necessary thing to continue. So he really supported that. Writing projects, music, theater, left that one out, so I apologize there, guys. But again, something that really kind of raises the spirits of people, not just in a time of need like a depression, but certainly, definitely, I think in a time of need. I said two adverbs there, so that must be pretty important. Okay. Socially, I do think this kind of is kind of a mixed, shall we say, outcome or whatever, because farmers that are not exactly large scale farmers, tenant farmers, in other words, kind of like your small, mom and pops farmers, if you will, they are not going to be getting the same support with agricultural adjustment that your larger commercial farmers will. All right. And that's a criticism, right? Because these commercial farmers, there's a word that's thrown around, agribusinesses, bonanza farms, et cetera. These are farmers that, they're struggling still, but they're not probably going to struggle as much as people that are losing their farms because of the penny auctions and things like that. Okay. And then also discrimination against women. Okay. This was a really, really big thing that I think if you do research, guys, on the First Lady, okay, Eleanor Roosevelt, excuse me, she was very big in advocating. FDR does appoint the first female cabinet member, Frances Perkins. I believe she was the Secretary of Labor, I believe it was. Okay, so kind of an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, and so you don't see a lot of the jobs programs that are as open to the idea of supporting women. Okay, now political. Change people's view of the role of government. How? Government's going to grow. It's going to get bigger. Guys, you got to have agencies to carry out a lot of these things. Regulations of the stock market. Why is there a website for the SEC? Why is there a website for the FDIC? Why is there a website for these other alphabet soup things that we talked about? And the answer is they still exist. And guys, a lot of people work for them. Ergo, government is going to grow to meet the needs of helping people out along those lines. Social Security, same thing. Type in ssa.gov. All right. And then political controversy that we just looked at. And then economic. Relieve poverty in some segments of society. Created large deficits. Okay. So again, planned deficit spending is going to be creating that. Okay. Sorry about that. Unions are going to be strengthened. That could be looked at as a good thing if you're looking at protecting workers. Public works projects. Okay. That's a very common thing, by the way, whenever you have stimulus programs. President Obama did a very similar kind of thing with the Great Recession in the 2009 moving forward. And then, guys, this is probably one of the things for those of you that are, young and perhaps the most, involved with banking and maybe even stock market to an extent. Okay. Strengthening banks and stock markets. Okay. I always ask this question, guys, to my students. How many of you have 100% confidence that if you were to go to your bank today, if you have an account, which a lot of you probably do, and you were to say to them, okay, I'm buying a car, I have $1,000 in there, whatever it might be, and I need to withdraw that amount to buy it, how many of you would have 100% confidence that that bank would say, Mr., Mrs. Smith, whatever your last name is, here you go? And almost everybody, guys, would answer yes to that. Not everybody regained that amount of confidence. But you got to remember, we're living in 2021, right? Which is, what is that, about 92 years, almost 92 years, excuse me, after the stock market crash back in 1929. Okay. So we've made a long way since then. There's, of course, a lot of progress you could argue with to go, but that's a story for another time with other presidencies. Okay, guys, as always, it's been great to kind of work you through some of these things. And these videos have been a little bit shorter than usual, but feel free to go back to some of your readings if you need to. Email me with any questions, thoughts, comments at bakerdfranklin.academy.org. And as always, stay safe, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Our next installment will cover World War II. Have a good one, and see you later. Bye-bye.